Hi, this is Morphagene from Make Noise. Right now I'm playing it as a granular synth, but it has quite a few other tricks up its sleeve. For example, its ability to time stretch, pitch shift, work as a delay, as a looper, a stereo sampler, a drum machine, and quite a few other things. In this video, I'll go over 20 or so things you can do with Morphagene. Let's get started. The most basic thing Morphagene can do is record or sample stereo audio. Audio can be sampled and then sliced in various ways in a RAM buffer that's almost 3 minutes long, called a reel. You can store up to 32 reels on one SD card, but only one reel can be loaded in memory at any given time. On a side note, throughout this video I'll be using various key combinations of the record, splice, and shift buttons. It takes a while to memorize these, but there's a really nice cheat sheet that lays them out by a Muff Wiggler user called 4hexagons, and there's an iOS app called Modes, which I highly recommend both for Morphagene as well as for many other modules that have a lot of menu items or sort of these hard to remember key combinations. One note about audio levels: Morphagene is set to handle Eurorack level audio as well as line level audio, which is what I have in this case coming from my computer. You can set levels by holding the record and shift key and then playing as loud as your computer can. That will help reduce the noise floor coming into Morphagene. Once you're ready to record, you can clear the reel like this, make sure it's empty, hit record, leave it, play a few notes, hit record again, and it will loop back. By default, Morphagene loops anything you record. You can stop it by plugging in a cable into the play input. It's normalized to play by default. You can also plug it into any voltage source and then control playback or stop it. The first knob we'll get acquainted with is the sound on sound knob. This controls whether input will be coming in from the computer in this case, alone, or just sample playback, right? Or any mix of the two. Now, Morphagene also gives us a few ways to control the speed and pitch of the audio being played back. We'll talk about time stretching later, but the simplest way is sort of like the way tape works, meaning that a sample plays faster as we pitch it up and slower as we pitch it down. We have simultaneous tape-style control of pitch and speed using the vary speed knob. So if I play back my sample, I can have it play at a higher pitch and therefore faster, at a lower pitch and therefore slower, and I can play in reverse, slower and faster. Right? Now you'll notice as I turn this knob, the colors over here on the side to which the knob is pointing change, and if I move it back forward, notice how the colors flip, and now the colors on this side change. This helps us figure out where we're at. So green means playback at the same speed and pitch that I recorded it, and then light blue means double the speed and pitch. Light purple means half the speed and pitch, meaning an octave down. Light peach, quarter speed and 2 octaves down. Same thing on the other side. Green means reverse playback at the same pitch and for however long the sample took. Now, what we just recorded is called a splice and it's part of a reel. Remember I said a reel can be up to 3 minutes long. This splice was only a few seconds long. We can always record another splice by hitting record, splice. And now we've recorded another splice. You move between the splices using the organize knob and you'll notice the splice color change here as well. And if we play them back, this is our first splice. This is our second splice. Back to the first. and second, and this can be voltage controlled, of course. You can also change splices by hitting the shift key and trigger this change with voltage as well. Now, regardless where you're at, I'll go to the first splice if I record another splice. The new splice gets added at the end, and it gets its own color as well. And now I can cycle through 3 splices. Now you may remember I said you can have up to 32 reels. If you want to move between the reels, you just hit splice and record, and then these colors start to change. I'll cycle through the various reels I have here, and I have one all the way at the end, which has these series of drums. I'll load it in. Now if I disconnect this, and then connect the end of splice gate to the shift button, you'll see it cycle between the various splices that are recorded in this reel. So you could use Morphagene as a drum machine with a properly sequenced series of splices on a reel, or with sequenced CV into the organize input. Okay, let's talk about overdubbing. Up until now, I've only been recording into empty splices by hitting either record when the reel is empty or record plus splice when there's already at least one splice in the reel. But if you hit record while you're in an existing splice, Morphagene will replace whatever audio is in that splice with the audio mix coming in through the SOS control. So I'll clear the reel and record a new loop. Now I'll let it play back. And the minute I hit record, anything I played has now been overdubbed onto this loop. This effectively makes Morphagene a looper with overdub. The only disadvantage this has is that every cycle, the audio that was there previously will play a little bit or a lot quieter depending on where the SOS knob is at. The farther it is counterclockwise, the louder your incoming audio and the lower your resampled audio is, and the faster this will die down. The farther it is clockwise, the lower your incoming audio, but then the higher the existing audio, and the longer it will take for the previous loop to fade out. Another way you can use Morphagene is as a resampler, which means it'll take whatever changes and whatever noodling we do over here and record that onto a new splice. So let's try that out. This is my existing loop. If I hit record plus splice, it'll now start recording whatever I do, and we'll get to these in a bit, so ignore this for a second. But everything I just did was now recorded into the next splice. So if we reset this for a second and go to the next splice, right? So this is what we just messed with and did, and everything was resampled into Morphagene. The next thing Morphagene can do is behave like a few types of delay effect. Typical delay effects have a time parameter, which means how long it takes them to repeat, and a feedback amount. To start with the simplest kind of delay, I'll set vary speed to green, which means it plays back the audio we feed into it at the same pitch. Now, we control the time parameter in our delay by recording a new splice for the length of the delay we'd like. So we'll tap a very quick tap if we want a short delay, and let's say I'll just make that my delay. So to activate my delay, I'll get this out of the way for a second. All I need to do is hit record. Now I'll get the amount of feedback or loops depending on where this knob is. So if I want more feedback, I'll turn it here. I might need to raise levels a bit because this also reduces the levels of the input coming in from my computer. If I want fewer delays, right, I'll turn the knob here. Now, as you may have guessed, if I turn this in reverse, and I'll hit green just for a second, I'll show you why in a bit, we get reverse delay. So what will happen if I don't hit the green precisely? Well, if I go a little bit above green, I'll get loops that go up. And if I go below it, I'll get a harmonized delay that goes lower every time. Now this harmonized delay, if you noticed, behaves a little oddly. Sometimes it's slow, and sometimes it's really quick. Right? Notice how it's slow here, and then it gets faster. Now the reason it doesn't keep precise tempo like it was when we were on green here is because Morphagene always records the splice at the same length, but it's playing back the splice at different speeds, and that misalignment causes these differences in the rate of delay when we're not on green, either forward or backwards. Now finally, I want to show you one more type of delay, or actually a single repeat effect, and for that I need to change one of the default options of Morphagene. Now the way to do that is to take out the SD card, plug it into a computer, and then change one of the parameters in the options.txt file. So I've gone ahead and opened the file, and the parameter I'm going to change is inop, or the input option, and I'm going to change that to 1 and plug it back into Morphagene. Now the options text file wasn't loaded yet. The fact that the shift button is off means that the SD card isn't mounted. All I need to do to mount it is hit the shift key. Now what the parameter that I changed does is change the function of the sound on sound knob, whereas before it determined the level of audio that would be recorded from either Morphagene or the incoming audio. Now Morphagene will only record the incoming audio, and the sound on sound knob controls the mix between the dry sound coming in and the wet effect coming out. So if I hit record now, I'll get one repeat based on the length of the splice, but a very different one. Very different effect compared to what we've had up until now. And if I start messing with these knobs, which I'll tell you what they are in a second, things get quite interesting. So what do these two knobs, or actually three knobs, do? Well, the module is called Morphagene, so they probably have something to do with morphing genes. Let's start with explaining genes or gene size, and then talk about morph, which is a little bit more complex. So just like splices are part of a reel, genes are slices out of a splice. So let's imagine this keyboard is an entire splice. A gene would be a subsection of this splice, and we can choose how big we want that subsection to be, and we can choose where it starts. So how big the slice is, or the gene is controlled with the gene size knob. Here it's as big as the splice, and as we turn it clockwise, the splice or slice or gene gets smaller and smaller, and the slide knob controls where the gene starts. So I'll go ahead and clear this reel, reset gene size to full, slide to start, and then I'll put this knob here. I'll explain why in a bit, and I'll record 4 chords. And of course I want them to play at the green speed. So if this is our splice and it has 4 chords recorded onto it, let's start hearing what it sounds like when I shorten the gene size. Right? So this is about the length of a chord. Make it shorter maybe. And now I can move or slide the beginning of the gene to the 2nd chord, 3rd chord, and 4th chord. And of course, we can go and create much smaller genes, and then scroll across our 4 chords. Right? Now you might notice that the transition between the genes is rather sharp and abrupt. Now this is actually another option that as of firmware 155 we can change. We can have the genes move or cycle between each other a bit smoother. So I'll go ahead and change that parameter as well in the SD card. And the parameter I'm looking for is GNSM, or gene smooth. I'm going to change that to 1. Okay, so let's talk about this morph knob, and it's a little bit tricky because it has a few steps that it goes through as you turn it clockwise. Notice the color here change as well, and it also has an additional layer of functionality if clock is running into Morphagene. We'll talk about that later. So the simplest behavior, if I turn back gene size to full, is just playing back the loop with a slight pause after each loop. Now, notice the color here. As I slowly turn this clockwise, the gap starts getting shorter until finally there is no gap. Now, as I keep turning this knob, notice the color change again. If we keep turning the knob clockwise, Morphagene will start playing the next gene before the first one ends. As we keep turning the knob, the next gene increasingly plays earlier until at some point a third instance will start playing. And if we keep turning the knob, you'll notice there's a final instance and then the genes start panning, and then finally some will be randomly pitched up, either an octave or a fifth. Now this effect gets really interesting as we play around with different morph positions, gene sizes, and of course slide the gene window across the sample. Right, we effectively turn a chord into a pad. If I erase this loop and record another one, let's just do this for a second. Then it gets really interesting the way that it inserts additional genes, even with full-length loops, to create these sort of interesting polymetric compositions. This is sort of like the phased looping technique I showed in a sampler video a couple weeks back, only with a twist of pitching up. Okay, let's move on. Another really cool feature introduced in firmware 155 is the ability to control Morphagene's pitch with 1 volt per octave increments, effectively turning it into sort of like a granular synth you can play with a keyboard or a sequencer. So to make this happen, I'll take the pitch output from the key step and plug that into the varispeed input, and I'll also take the gate output and plug that to control playback of the note. Put this back here. Now the first thing I want to do after I clear my reel is to sample 1 note. Now since the voltage coming out of key step is added to whatever this is at, I need to lower this down, and I also need to lower the octaves here as much as possible. So first thing, I'll shorten the grain size and find the spot I like, and reverb won't hurt either. Now the challenge is to tune it using this control, this attenuverter. Now don't be shy, use a tuner if you don't feel confident you're hearing the sounds right. Even though this is quantized, so it does make life a little bit easier, still it may take a while to find the right spot. You can transpose the entire keyboard by changing the varispeed offset. And if you don't find the exact spot, it may seem right, but some notes might be off. So you just have to tweak it until you find the sweet spot. Okay, maybe now. Nice. The only real disadvantage to putting Morphagene in volt per octave mode is that when you turn vari-speed, it doesn't move smoothly between the pitches, but sort of transposes by, I guess, semitones. Now, playing volt per octave like this is pretty nice, but Morphagene is limited to one synth voice, so theoretically it's monophonic. But you can sort of fake a polyphonic synth by recording a few chord splices, say one with a major chord and another with a minor chord, and then transposing those. So let me show you. So I'll record two chords, let's say one like this, right? And another like this. Only this second chord was recorded into a second splice. Let's transpose the keyboard and hear what this sounds like. Sometimes it takes a while to find the right sweet spot between gene size and morph amount. Okay, that's good enough. Now, if I change the splice, I'll get a minor chord. And now I can play chords. So let's say major, major, and then minor, then back to major, right? Just by changing the splices and playing the root of the chord on the keyboard. So I could go ahead and create additional splices with other chord types and essentially play Morphagene polyphonically with a chord bank. Okay, let's clear this up. And let's talk about time stretching and pitch shifting. And I'll record a simple phrase. Now, as I mentioned before, vari-speed works like tape. If I pitch it up, the sample will play faster. And if I pitch it down, the sample playback will slow down. But what if we wanted to pitch the sample up or down without changing its playback rate, or change the tempo without changing the pitch? Now, I can do that manually by narrowing the gene size and then sliding through the sample. Right? So if I slide at this rate and now increase the pitch, then go through it again, right, I'm playing at a higher pitch, but at the same rate. So I could modulate the slide or start point with a ramping LFO, but the clock input helps us take care of that. So I've got clock coming in here from Pam's workout. Let's take this, plug it into here, get it going. All right, so this is, remember, if it's green, this is the original pitch, but not the same tempo. I can make it go faster. Let's select tempo here. Right, so as I increase the tempo, it stays at the same pitch. Now I could pitch it, let's say, up. It'll play at the same rate, or pitch it down. It'll still play at the same rate or same BPM determined here. Right? And I could slow it down as well if I wanted to. Now, this all happens as long as the morph knob is after about 11 o'clock or 12 o'clock here. Notice the color of the vari-speed LED here on the left, right? The one that the vari-speed knob isn't pointing to changes as I move this counterclockwise. So as long as it's blue, right, we're going to get time stretching, as well as all the other effects we talked about before, right? So the panning and the pitch shifting as well. And it's going to take into consideration the gene size too. Right, so really cool. Now, if we move this counterclockwise to where it's no longer blue, something different happens. So let me explain this with some peace and quiet. So what happens, you might ask, when Morphagene receives clock, but the morph knob isn't after around 12 o'clock, but rather is in this area? This mode is called chronological scanning. What it does is it plays through the splice one gene at a time at the clock rate, which means that the smaller the gene, the longer that it'll take Morphagene to scan through the sample. So let's now listen to this understanding that. Right, as I slice down to really tiny genes, it takes much longer to play through every gene slot in the splice. As I move the gene size counterclockwise to make it bigger, it'll move through the splice much faster. Right, so this is different than time stretching and pitch shifting, but still quite an interesting effect. Cool. By the way, if you don't like the fact that this area represents chronological scanning and this area represents time stretch and pitch shifting, you can change the options.txt file on the SD card to have it that it's one or the other. Now, there's a third use for the clock input other than time stretching and chronological splice scanning, and that is for synchronizing the record start and stop times based on the clock. Now I'm going to set the bar length at the divide by 4 output here. And just to help me with timing, I'll turn the left function of maths into a metronome. I'll use this to trigger every beat. I'll create a really short and snappy envelope here. Now I could cue this somewhere, but for the purpose of this demo, I'll just plug it into the right input. Right, and now we can hear the clock in one ear. Maybe actually this will be better for me. Now I'll set the vary speed to green, then reduce these guys, and move this to loop perfectly. And when I hit record, it won't turn white until the next clock beat. And same goes for shutting off record. Now if I record and use splice, it won't start recording until the next clock tick. Same goes for turning off recording. When I hit the button, it won't shut off until the next beat. Now, we're still hearing splice 1, but I can always move to splice 2. Did I mention subscribers get this quality music on a weekly basis? And I can always move back to slice 1 and create new slices and so on, all in perfect sync. Cool, let's clean this up and let's talk about a few smaller things. So you'll notice when I hit the keys, you'll see a response here. This is also output as an envelope follower through this CV output. So you could use this as sidechain for some other audio or to modulate any of the parameters that have an input over here, like the vary speed, or even choose a different splice if you wanted using the envelope follower. There's also a neat phase modulation option. So if I, let's say again, record this chord. Now this is also something you need to enable in the options.txt file on the SD card. I have this enabled by default because I don't see how this can interfere with the way that I work. So if you unplug these two cables, then the right input can be used as phase modulation. So I'll take, let's say, this LFO into here, and then I'll start playing back this. You can hear this sort of wobble. This is without phase modulation, and maybe if I pick a slightly less interesting tone, find the anti-sweet spot. Notice how when I modulate it, maybe I increase the LFO rate. Right, this can be a very interesting effect, and as you go into audio rates, you can get some pretty aggressive tones as well. You could also use a random or sample and hold LFO to introduce ever so slight flutter into the way a sample is played back. So I've got this going through maths in order to slew a sample and hold coming out of Pam's workout. I'll take this, plug it into the Varispeed. Start with 0 modulation. So, and 0 over here. So this is the core sound. But if I want to sort of slightly break it down a bit and have it wobble, right? I can have this go faster or slower to taste. A relatively fast rate. Just a really nice way to introduce subtle modulation and texture to your sound. A final little trick that I wanted to show you is how to precisely slice a splice. So I'll record 4 notes. Now to splice up a splice, you just hit the splice button while it's playing. The question is, how do you find the spot that's exactly between 2 of the 4 notes? So to splice this precisely, all I need to do is narrow down my gene size, then scan through the notes, find the beginning of this note, move back, right? This is, I guess, close enough, and just hit the splice button. Now if I bring things back to normal, I've got 2 splices. One with these 2 notes, and then one with the second couple of notes. So that's how you splice precisely. So if you found these tips and tricks useful, there are plenty more in my book available to people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if you learned something. Ring the YouTube bell after you subscribe if you want to see the next one. Thanks very much for watching.